And we are live. We are joined live this hour by Carlos Andres Gomez. He is a writer, an author, a poet, a performer, a workshop leader, guest lecturer. The list goes on. I'm sure we'll find out more about it. Before any of that, before you were, all these multiple things. Carlos, let's talk about how you got your start. I mean, how did you begin? When did you first realize you wanted to be a writer?
Um, First off, Matt, thanks so much for doing this, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this incredible project. Um, I would say the beginning of my life, the last 15 years since June 1st, 2005, I've been a full-time artist, and so I feel like I got to go to the beginning. It would be to name how my creative and artistic journey started, and I think it really started. I think the moment that I admitted to myself that I was a poet, although I'd been sort of writing quietly for a few months, was when Martin Espada came to my high school. The great, he's Puerto Rican, New Yorican poet. And I was 17 years old. I was a senior in high school. And he came and he read from his book, Imagine the Angels of Bread. And I just sat in the last row of the auditorium and just wept. I'd never encountered poetry like Martin Espada's. I never knew that you could tell those stories in poems. I never knew that a poem could feel like it was carved out of my own life. So yeah, I think that was the beginning. When I was 17 years old. That was I'm trying to think how that was 21 years ago now. And I walked up to him at the end of his reading, and I bought a copy of Imagine the Angels of Bread. And he wrote, and he looked in my eyes. He got all he could get was my name, and he wrote "Para Carlos, Poeta del Futuro, Martin Espada" inside the book. For Carlos, poet of the future, and handed it to me. And it's like he could see that I was a poet without me even telling him. And I think that kind of that push and that affirmation at that moment in my life, I think, set me on this strange, very bizarre and wonderful artistic path that I've been on, I think, since then.
Yeah. So tell us about so you begin before you get notoriety and these other things. I'm sure the discipline to do so began much earlier, but the first thing you get really a lot of notoriety for is your poetry. So can you tell us about
Mhm.
when you started getting your poetry out there? What were some of the venues you were attending? Like where is this taking place?
Yeah.
Just give us that history.
So I was living in, I'd actually moved from living in New York, living in the city, to Providence, Rhode Island, my freshman year of high school, after I got kicked out of a Catholic school. So to go live with my mom, and my dad said, kind of said, let my mom kind of figure this out, hopefully. Um, so that was in Providence, Rhode Island, where I saw Martin Espada. Shortly before I saw Martin Espada, I saw the movie Slam with Saul Williams and Sonia Son, and that movie had a huge impact on my life as well. It was another, I think, my first real invitation into a way to do poetry that I'd never encountered um, in the poetry modules in my public school. you know and so which I didn't feel any kind of connection to at all. And so the first place I went to a gallery cafe. It was like an open mic on the east side of Providence, every Wednesday night with my friend Andrew from my high school. And then I think, sort of continuing to follow Martin Espada and Saul Williams and some other people, I kept hearing about the New Eureka Poets Cafe. And at this time, my father was still living in the city, so I was going every like other weekend back to the city. And I went to the New Eureka Poets Cafe for the first time in 1999, and that it was like, nothing I'd ever experienced. And I feel like, to understand my creative journey, the New Eureka Poets Cafe on the Lower East Side of Manhattan has always been. I think it's always been kind of, if there was ever a place that I was to name as my creative home, that's the place on East Third Street between Avenues B and C. You know, much thanks to Miguel Algarin, Mikey Pinheiro, everybody who made that place possible. Um, I think that was the place where I really cut my teeth and built my chops. And that was doing the open slam on Wednesday nights, doing the Friday night poetry slam, where they pack. Well, in the pre-COVID days, they pack 350 people into a place that's whose fire code is 148, and little 2 by 4 foot creaky box that kind of, rocks back and forth while you try to stand on it, and spotlight coming down, and you have to try to captivate those people. And so I think that's where I really, I think, built my chops. And I went to college in Philadelphia. That was a big part of, I think, my journey as well. They used to have a big citywide poetry slam on the first Friday of every month in Old City in Philly. And I started going to that in 2000 when I started college. And I remember in 2000 at the first Fridays at the Painted Bride, I saw, Black Thought, Tariq Trotta would come through, Jill Scott would come through, Ursula Rucker would be there. You see all these, like, back in the day, like, I mean, Philly, still the Philly legends. And similar but different from the Nuyorican. It was a little more like people would dress up a little more than in that era in the Nuyorican. It was a little more kind of upscale, a little more bougie. Because first Fridays would be, people would be going to get their free wine and look at all the art exhibits around Old City. And this would be kind of one of the culminating things a lot of people would do. So they'd go, do wine tastings and see art, and then some people would end at the Painted Bride for the first Friday poetry slam. They pack 300-400 people in the Painted Bride, and then they have like a little cash prize or whatever. So I think that was like where I really, in the poetry scene in Philly and the poetry scene in New York, in particular the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, and then later going to Bar 13 and the Bowery Poetry Club. I think that's where I really just sort of developed myself as a poet. And it's interesting because a lot of things that I ended up doing outside of poetry were serendipitously tied to me performing at the Nuyorican. Like me doing Inside Man, I was living in Bushwick in Brooklyn, and I was a last minute fill-in for a poetry slam because my friend needed they needed somebody to come in and perform because the house was packed. The regular host hadn't lined up all the people they were supposed to for a poetry slam, and I performed at the last minute. And there was a casting director there, Kim Coleman, who was casting Inside Man, and she saw me, and that started that whole bizarre journey. So I mean, there's a lot of things that the Nuyorican has been tied to. Even my memoir, before I pitched the book to Penguin, my editor Travers Johnson, who was a big champion of the book, he saw me perform at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe before we pitched Gotham Books, the imprint at Penguin that picked up the memoir. He was at the Nuyorican seeing one of my shows at the Nuyorican. So I don't know. I think poetry has always been. It's always been, it's my primary always when it comes to art and creativity. But now that I've done a lot of other things, I think people oftentimes may know me through some other medium, and they don't realize that I've always been, and I was always a poet first. Poetry, it was never an add-on. Like everything else was something that I discovered through poetry. So yeah, it's been an incredibly strange, bizarre journey in terms of creatively and in poetry. And the Nuyorican Poets Cafe is a place that's always been very, very sacred to me, I think, because it'll always be a place that I always think of I can go back to. I hope I can forever go back to, that I always remember my 17-year-old version stepping up on stage, cotton mouthed, so terrified with my hand shaking so much I could barely read the paper I was holding, And so I think, yeah, I guess that's like, I guess, the quickest snapshot I could give of the last 20 some odd years.
Yeah. So no, it's fantastic. But I would, like you mentioned some of the leading lights you saw at the Painted Bride. Can you talk about some of the people that you first saw at the Nuyorican that were really inspirational to you? That really, like,
absolutely. I mean, I've known, Willie Perdomo for a very long time. I've always, I've known Willie probably as long as I've been going to the Nuyorican. He's somebody I mean, now I've known him for so long, I can't remember if I project him into some of those memories in the late 90s and early 2000s, though he's been around the Nuyorican since the early 90s. But Willie Perdomo is one of those people. Felice Bell, let me see. I mean, Keith Roach was there. Who else? Ellison Glenn, aka Black Cracker, Sarita McFadden, Breon Bain. This is kind of going to the 2000s. Breon Bain, Maida del Valle. Yeah, there were just so many people. I mean, Reggie Gaines, you'd see there. Stacy and Chin. I mean, there were a lot of people who have gone on to do really incredible things, that were in that space. And I think what was so inspiring to me as I watched them in that space, taking risks and trying things out. And I think that gave me a lot of permission. People who, when I was 17, 18, and I was so new to everything, and I'd see people that, as far as I'm concerned, these were legends, and they would get up there and they'd read a piece that they wrote, you know, you know, they wrote it on the F train coming over from Brooklyn. They wrote it in the park before they got up on the mic. And so I think seeing people take those risks and kind of putting themselves out there like that, people who it seemed like were so far ahead of wherever I thought I could ever be, but also making themselves vulnerable and taking risks that someone of their stature, as I appraised them, didn't have to take risks like that. They had tons of poems they could have done and got a standing ovation, but they were always, I think that's not, I don't know if that's changed or not, because I don't go to open mics like I used to at all. I mean, obviously I'm not going to any right now, but in the era that I came up in, particularly when I went to Bar 13 later, the expectation was every week you bring a new poem. Like, you don't keep doing the same poems. Everyone has deep pockets because you keep writing constantly. And I think as things evolve, that I felt like that kind of changed a little bit. But I don't know where that is now. I don't know if I'm the most informed person about where that is now. But yeah, I think that journey. I think a lot of those mentors that I had, like Lynn Prokop, Rachel McKibbins later. Marty McConnell. I had so many. I mean, Patricia Smith is somebody I have to forever mention as a mentor. I saw her when I was 17 in the late 90s, but that was featuring in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I drove up when I was in Providence. But yeah, I mean, if I think about like people that have been my greatest mentors, whether it's in communication or seeing them or sort of the modeling that they've been, the three primary ones would be Martina Espada, Patricia Smith, and Willie Perdomo. Those are probably the top three. But I've been really lucky to be around, I think, constantly surrounded by people who were smarter than me, more experienced than me, and just knew more about everything. And I think that I felt like I was in a boot camp trying to build myself as a writer and a performer. And there was no letting up, particularly when I lived in New York. I just moved 8 months ago, but I was living there the last 15 years, and there was always that expectation. You're always growing, you're always pushing.
So tell us about HBO Def Poetry Jam. I mean, how did that come about? Like, how long have you been doing poetry by the time you got to?
Yeah, when I did Def Poetry, I probably been doing poetry for like 6 or 7 years, and in that era, it was interesting. I was in the last season of Def Poetry, so the funny thing about it was I had a bunch of friends who had done Def Poetry, and I'd actually submitted probably 2 or 3 seasons, and I got the phone call 2 of the 3 times that I was on the final wall. So like, you're on the final casting wall, and they pick maybe, I don't know how many people, maybe half the people on that wall get picked to tape, and I never made it to taping. And then the last season, I was like, man, forget it, I'm not going to do it. So I didn't even submit. And then they called me up and wanted me to tape. So they must have remembered me from the wall before and said, we should bring Carlos back, whatever. Or maybe a casting person saw me at something, who knows? I mean, yeah, I mean, it was one of those things. I'd been performing in New York consistently for a while at that point, because it was the fall of 2005. So I've been performing about 6 years in New York at different venues, and it was a very bizarre scenario. I mean, I think when you're doing something for television or something else, there's so many other considerations and concerns that are very, very different than when you're doing any other kind of poetry performance, because they're shooting it with 8 different cameras, and you get one take on the 2 poems that you're doing, if you flub both of those, then you're not going to air. Even if you don't flub it, you may not air. I mean, I remember in that era, like half the people who taped would air. So it was like, it was really wild. They said if you're over 2 minutes, there's no chance you'll air. So and they told, and of course, you know, Stan Lathan is telling us this 4 hours before we tape. So I had friends who were on there, so I made my poem a minute 40 before I even, you know, walked in there. But there's some people with 3-minute poems that were about to tape that had 4 hours to try to take, you know, a minute 10 seconds off their poem before they stood in front of 600 people at the supper club with 8 cameras, you know, and didn't mess it up. It was weird. It was a weird experience. My first, I was very, very tight on that. I did like this horrible corny love poem, and the audience was definitely not feeling it. And then my second poem was What's Genocide, which is a very different tonal register, very different thematic concerns than my love poem. And I thought my love poem was just like kind of like a warm up, but it went so badly, it bombed so badly that I was actually kind of annoyed. I think at myself, at the room, at everything, and that ended up being really good fuel because I thought that my performance of What's Genocide was very strong. But yeah, it was that was kind of I think a learning experience for me too, which is a lesson that I learned from a my great director, genius, theater savant, Tamala Woodard, who told me when we were working on a solo play a number of years ago, and she said, you always have until the last word to save a performance. Like it's never over, and that's why you never give up on a live performance ever, because you have until the last word to save it. And so I think that I've learned this many times, but you can blank on a poem, you can drop a poem, you can fumble it, you can flub it, you can not be in your body, you can struggle with your presentness. But if you're present on that last moment, an audience will forgive everything else. And I think that for me to be able to just kind of like, okay, this first poem was a complete catastrophe, in a very tight room. It was a very, very tight room. I think it was, perhaps like mostly tourists who didn't really want to be there. I mean, it was not a very generous group of folks in the supper club. And then I just sort of got up and did my second poem and really, really got in my body and just sort of arrived in the room and I think just lived the poem rather than trying to like do something with it. And yeah, so I think every single one of these kind of strange, odd experiences I've had have been a learning process for me that have helped me grow, helped me cut my teeth a little bit, and helped me, I think, move closer to the performer that I aspire to be.
Yeah. Do you find you perform best when you feel like you've been immediately disrespected? I know that's really true for me. Like a moment of immediate disrespect.
That's a really great point. I mean, I think that a lot of my creative output was in some way reactive, particularly in the earlier half, I think, of my artistic career. That's not so much the case anymore. I will say this though, if I feel disrespected or someone pisses me off, I mean, it definitely fuels something distinctive that I notice helps me really cut through in a room, in a moment, in a way. Like the stakes are clear, I don't need to think about them. They're understood in my body. There's something very very primal, very visceral about, I think, when you think you're being disrespected or underestimated or something else. And I think a lot of that too, the era that I was going to the Eurekan in the early 2000s, I performed in the Eurekan. I did the Apollo a couple times. And I think frequently in that era, I was getting up in rooms where people didn't know what to do with me. And not just that, like people were clowning me. People were like, who is this clown? And so I think that was something I loved, that underdog. I loved being the guy that nobody expected anything from and could flip a room very quickly. That was like at the Apollo. They were booing so hard when I did the Apollo. This is in mid 2000s. They were booing me so hard when I got up at Emerson at the Apollo that I had to like really get my mouth into the mic just so they could hear anything. And I did a 49-second poem and I won. And I knew enough about performing that I said, if I can stun them and surprise them with something that's like really, where like the kind of like acrobatics of what I do and everything else in 40. If I do I was like, I had 3 minutes, but I was like, they'll never pay attention for 3 minutes. I was like, if I can just surprise them with a novelty of what's happening, that's going to be such a stark disconnect from I think what they may anticipate from me. If I walk off at the height of that disorientation, I'll get a standing ovation. And that's exactly what happened. So it was starting off so much booing, I could tell they were about to turn the siren on. Then they got completely pin drop silent. And then I'm surprised they actually let me win, because there was a lot of booing that had come initially from the balcony. And I put a middle finger up at the end of my poem, which you're definitely not supposed to do, but I guess they didn't see it. And I got a standing ovation at the end of my poem. And then I ended up winning because it was just the novelty. They're like, that's classic New York. They're like, I'm going to hate on you, but if you don't blink, I'll give you everything. It's a classic New Yorker moment. So yeah, I mean, there was so much learning in every time, and so many rooms where I got up in New York. I mean, so many venues. I mean, Brooklyn Academy of Music. Gosh, like the Mercury Lounge, Canal Room. There were so many places around the city. Every room had its own. I mean, it's New York. Every room has its own ghosts in the room. It's got its own energy. It's got its own geography. All that stuff, I think, informs how you as a performer live in the room. So yeah, there's nothing like that.
Yeah, so I want to get to Inside Man, and I want to
Sure.
I want to talk about your newest book, and your collection, where people can find your books and stuff. But before we do that, you have made kind of a career of touring college campuses. So I kind of want to do like kind of a practical service here for people.
Sure, absolutely.
How you got to do that, but like more, what advice do you have for people on the who are new to getting? I mean, obviously right now we're all in lockdown, but
yeah.
For those, when this comes out of this, for those who are trying to get on the college circuit, what should they know once they're on it?
The biggest thing that I think people make a mistake in is you need to have a particular, like, I know the word brand for a lot of artists is like a really dirty word. Name it whatever you want, the spirit of what you do, whatever it is. There has to be some obsession you have of some socio-political, cultural relevance that you center yourself around when it comes to entering the college market. Do you know what I'm saying? And that can really be anything. Like what is it? Are you like into like healthy like sleep hygiene? Are you into do you talk about like how mentorship networks can subvert like hierarchy and stratification in higher ed? Do you want to, like, whatever your thing is, that's the program you pitch to colleges. And I think it has to be something that this is my opinion too. I always think the person you are is the only angle. You know what I mean? Like, don't pitch something you think is cute. Like, do something that you love and you believe in and you're informed about. I feel like on some level that will ultimately have the greatest longevity and the greatest resonance. And also, if you're successful, you don't want to be doing something you hate and don't actually believe in. So I know for me, a lot of the stuff that I go to college is about is a lot of it's engaging with men, talking about restrictive masculinity, talking about sexism to men, talking about ideas about gender and gender role playing. And that's something that I've been obsessively sort of interrogating, excavating in myself, thinking about in the world, writing about, written plays, memoirs, poems for, the last 15 years almost. So, I mean, it's like that work is an extension of my own personal work, and I think colleges, it's not enough, as I've seen it, to have like a long-term impact in any market really, and just say, I'm really good at poetry. Like, if you're the US Poet Laureate, like, do whatever you want. You know what I mean? Like, if you're, like, that's fine. If you're Joy Harjo, like, just be Joy Harjo, or, if you have a Pulitzer Prize, like, if you're Jericho Brown, like, just do, be Jericho Brown. But if you don't have a Pulitzer, you're not the, the Poet Laureate, yeah, there has to be something else. Like, as much as I wish people would bring me just for doing poetry, it's actually very rarely that. There's something else that I'm bringing that is filling in like gaps, or that is addressing something where there's a real need within that community. And my greater work, which actually is not necessarily, it is very interwoven with a lot of my creative work, but it's not necessarily about my poetry. It's about something else. That's my biggest advice for people who are trying to break into the college market, or really any market.
Yeah, that's solid advice. Solid advice. And everyone should know also that, be prepared to wait for checks.
Oh yeah. Yeah, don't expect to get paid that day. It's very good advice.
So yeah, so like you're really one of these, I mean, there's a number of other people who've done it, but you are really one of the shining examples of being able to parlay poetry into just finding niches all over the place. I mean, the fluidity that is afforded poets is I don't know if everyone realizes it, and I definitely know not everyone takes advantage of it, but you are someone that really
Yeah.
has. So can you talk a little bit about like this opportunity you had to work in a Spike Lee film? I mean, expand on that. Tell us how that came about.
Yeah. I mean, that was just a kind of a total absurd story. I mean, that was I sort of mentioned it in passing before, but friend of mine was hosting the Nuyorican. They needed somebody to fill in at the last second for a Friday night slam because there was a sold out house and they didn't have any poets. At the time, I was, like I was just like I was not very far from the cafe. We were like texting my friend who was hosting. Went down to the cafe, did my poems, and there was Kim Coleman was there with Eve Striger, who is her assistant, who's now a big casting director. And they were calling me in for a one-line part. It was the line was, I think it even got cut from the film. I don't think it made the film. Was like, do you have Mets tickets tonight or something? And I went in for that role, and they were kind of intrigued by me, and they wanted me to read some other stuff. And they just were like, let's just try something wild, and they had me read for one of the bank robbers, Steve. And then I just kept getting called back. The list getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then I ended up doing a reading with doing an audition with Spike, but he was like, no, take the script away. He's like, I want you to just freestyle. So we just ad-libbed, like he's like, just improvise. So we improvised the script, the scene, and then he was like, I heard you do poetry. He's like, I want to see you freestyle for me. And I freestyled for Spike. And he jumped up out of his seat, gave me a big pound and a big hug, and he was like, my man. He's like, okay. He's like, okay, Carlos Gomez. The time I wasn't using the Andres as much.
Yeah.
And so yeah, and then I ended up getting the call, and I on June 1st, I quit my job at the time working as a social worker in Harlem in the Bronx, and I was teaching part-time on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And I went into wardrobe on June 1st, 2005, and I shot that whole summer until the end of August. And I've been a full-time artist ever since then. So it's been it was yeah, an incredible, bizarre, strange, serendipitous blessing that I think on so many levels enabled the life that I have now. And I'm forever grateful to Spike and to 40 Acres and to shoot Brian Grazer and everybody on that. It was a really yeah, it was wild. But yeah, definitely not. It's people are always trying to find like a blueprint for that story, like what's something that I can learn from that for myself. And I always think, man, it was truly like one of those. It was truly one of those like one in a million moments where something just panned out in a way that was completely unexpected.
Yeah. So I mean, it was kind of interesting though. You ended up they cast you as an Armenian.
Yes, they did. They did.
Kind of that universal Anthony Quinn, following the footsteps of Anthony Quinn and
yeah,
another ambiguous like
yeah, I know,
Isaac.
just like ambiguously something.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of that's the fate of the bronze man, I suppose. But so yeah, no, that's incredible. That's an incredible story. That's incredible. But you also had an eye to get yourself into different places. I mean, you're always creating opportunities for yourself because, but at the base is poetry, and I don't think people realize just how how much possibility there is as a poet. Like you can find yourself in like the most bizarre places.
Oh yeah.
The credential is that you're good at poetry, and
No, absolutely. And that's not. I always, I think of, a number of friends in there. Like great models are a lot of the folks in the Dark Noise Collective. Dinez Smith and Fatima Asghar and Nate Marshall and Aaron Samuels and like Franny Choi. Am I forgetting something? Someone I probably am. Um, Safiel Hillo in there. I don't know. Safiel Hillo is like a friend, maybe in there. I don't know. But just thinking about people who've done all these incredible things, I think about, someone like, Aaron Samuels, who is, a co-founder and COO of Blavity, and is an incredible poet. Or, I think about people like Franny Choi, hosts an incredible podcast with Dinez, and Dinez performed on the Tonight Show, and all these things. You see people who are great poets but are not inhibited by the title of poet. And I think that's something that I've always been very resistant to being pigeonholed. And it's funny because I got an MFA in creative writing a couple years back, and it's funny because a lot of people in performance circles back in the day, this has changed dramatically. A lot of them were very suspicious of even the idea of getting an MFA, of the academy, of all these different things. And I mean, I have huge issues with the academy and everything else, of course, but definitely so opposed to the idea that they would never even consider getting an MFA as writers, as poets. And then I think about a lot of the people within academia, very entrenched in the traditional old white man canon, and so many of them have really classist, racist, sexist, etc. notions about any of the performance arts arenas. So like if you have any credentials or any credibility within as a performer, they assume that you're not a serious writer. And I've always tried to really, really push against that. Like I've studied all types of, I've studied, Harold long form improv. I've studied as an actor, Adler technique, Chekhov, Meisner, Stanislavski. I've studied acting technique for film. I've also like been very serious about my writing, and this idea that you have to like pick, like you can't be serious and have tools and techniques that you've developed and you've polished and you've perfected over time, and that you're always growing and evolving to build and sharpen as a writer, as a performer, as many other things. You have to like pick one, and that was very much, I think, an idea, such a false, deeply problematic notion that I think a lot of people seem to subscribe to or just sort of conceded to for many years when I started, particularly in the 2000s. And I think for me, I'm always like if I've got a poem that stands up on paper, why can't I rock this room? Why can't I perform it for 3,000 people? Like why? And of course, as we both know, a lot of the ideas, a lot of the associations that are embedded in those ideas of pigeonholing are informed by white supremacy, are informed by the settler colonial mindset, are informed by things that inform everything, right? But they also inform the ways that ultimately it's a way to try to inhibit or discredit or keep people out of having access to certain opportunities. The world that was built, the hegemony and the hierarchy and everything else was built so that Fatima Asghar could not get an Emmy nomination, for her web series. It was she should not be allowed to be a poet and a screenwriter. Aaron Samuel should not be able to be an award-winning poet and also found an incredible company, tech company. So yes, I don't know. For me, I'm always forever fighting against the idea that I have to be. There's nothing to me that is off limits creatively. There's nothing I would not consider. I've. You said what?
No, go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like I've written a couple plays. I starred and wrote a play that I took to the Edinburgh Fringe and to a bunch of festivals in New York. I've written a memoir. I've done voiceover work on video games. I've acted for television and film. I've been a keynote speaker at to me, there are no boundaries. I never understand people who almost even take pride in not considering things. I'm saying why can't we just forget everything? Why do there have to be any limitations to the labels that we can carry to the platforms that we access. So yeah, I mean, I'm forever keeping my mind open, and I think even right now, in the time of COVID, in the time of coronavirus, during this shutdown, in this messy transition into whatever new world we don't yet know, I think um, there are more things that I'm going to explore and consider that I never had to think about before. And yeah, to me, that's as terrifying as it is. That's also exciting, and it's also an opportunity.
Yeah, I want to get into your books, your memoirs,
Sure,
and find out where we can purchase those. But before we do that, I want to ask a quick question. When you're
sure.
like making your way in the academy and these it's very much more like kind of the halls of prestige and et cetera, do you ever feel like Birdman?
That's great. Yeah. Uh, I feel like a lot of things. I mean, I will say this, that I think that could mean so many things, but yeah, like yeah. Tell me more what that means to you,
Okay,
because
okay,
that
okay.
means
I'll tell you
certain
what it means to
things.
me. And
That
it's
means
about
that
you.
means certain things to me. But
This is
I
about you,
love
not
I love this question. I love
okay,
this
because
question.
it's about you and not me. But this is how I always feel, right? Because
Yeah,
like
yeah,
I am somebody who's, written poetry, gotten some books, whatever,
yeah.
and I'm much more invited by like like sociology departments, history departments, whatever, than I am by like English,
Sure,
whatever. And so I've
sure.
spoken like
Me as well. Me as well.
so I've spoken at the University of Cambridge, right? Like, and I
Uh-huh.
like a little guest thing, whatever, there, for like a week.
Yeah,
But every time I do these things, not dealing with sociology, not dealing with history, not doing this, because those things I can find my way in. But like when
yeah.
I deal with these English departments, so kind of the more literati, I always feel like, oh yeah, you do that political thing. Oh yeah, you do that. Oh yeah, like whatever. And it's at first a compliment, and then and then a threat, and then, and then like
Yeah.
and then
Well,
an attempted ejection. And so like
yeah,
always
yeah.
end up fighting these things.
That's
So
funny.
my biggest thing is Birdman, right? Because like this guy is
Yeah.
he's a great like film star, but
Mm-hmm.
he can do this other thing as well, and he can do it just as
Mm-hmm.
well as them, and they will not
Mm-hmm.
accept that.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that's why that's why
No,
I feel.
that's really great. There was one step you missed there. What did you say? You said first they seem to praise you. You said then it's a threat, then it's ejection. I think it's kind of like the false compliment, then kind of the slur, then the threat, then the ejection. Because I feel like a lot of the qualifiers they put on the kind of poet I am aren't necessarily insults, but when it emerges from a particular person, it's clearly an insult. Do you know what I'm saying? Like hip hop for me, like I would not exist without hip hop. I wouldn't be a writer without hip hop. When I was a teenager, I would go to MC battles, and I watch friends who are b-boys and b-girls battle and all this other stuff. I go to ciphers and all that, and I would just watch. I would not participate. I'd just be, just kind of bop my head on the side, cheering my friends on. So hip hop as a concept and as a term is not an insult. But if somebody who has no respect or knowledge about hip hop calls you a hip hop poet, that's a slur as far as I'm concerned. Do you know what I'm saying? Or if somebody like the idea of spoken word to me is not an insult, but if somebody who appraises that as a pseudo art form that has no sort of technique, craft, no history, no lineage, that's a slur. Do you know what
Yeah,
I'm saying?
yeah,
So when people call me a hip hop poet or a spoken word poet or whatever else, to me they're degrading not just what I do, but my personhood. And that's also, I mean, that's inflected with, I mean, race, ethnicity. You see that with class and with gender and with sexuality. So many things with how poets have qualifiers put before the term poet. Um, and it's funny how many times I always put in a bio just poet, and I never get called poet, almost never, which is so funny. It's like, they'll never call me a poet, even though I've been a poet for a long time, so, but yeah, like yeah, definitely, it definitely feels like that. I mean, I think something that I think is deeply disorienting for people in those in the Ivy Tower when I go and I give a keynote, or when I go and do a workshop, is I have certain measures of credibility now that I think really complicate their own relationship to who I'm supposed to be.
mhm,
Because a lot of times too, I'll show up and, I mean, a lot of times I'll show up and I'll just be wearing like a Brooklyn hoodie and whatever, and I'll go do my keynote at Yale or whatever, and then they don't know what to do, because they're like, well, he has these markers that for anyone else would definitively, would verify that he is somebody that we have to take seriously. as a, as a thinker, as a writer, as an intellectual. But there are other parts of this picture that we can't reconcile with those with those credentials.
Right.
And I think I've always been kind of like an unsettling idea because of my who I am and my identity and my history and my other things. So I think I've just sort of just have the habit of even leaning more so into those things that are discomforting for the gatekeepers in those ivy towers.
Yeah, definitely. So
as a form of subversion, as a form of subverting their own notion of all these things.
which makes for a smooth transition into Hijito. Can you tell us a little bit about your latest work and
Absolutely.
with that?
Yeah. So I wrote a memoir called Man Up: Reimagining Modern Manhood that came out 8 years ago, and that's in paperback. I put out a chapbook last fall called Hijito with Platypus Press in the UK, and that's been that was. I mean, I put out a bunch of self-published stuff, but that's like my first real poetry project that's been out in the world. That being said, it is a chapbook. This fall, my full-length collection, my full-length debut poetry collection, Fractures. Sorry about that. My full-length debut poetry collection, Fractures, will be coming out with the University of Wisconsin Press this fall. So definitely have to give a shout out. Hijito is only possible because of the great Eduardo C. Corral, amazing poet, amazing mentor, guide, godfather to so many of us poets. He selected my manuscript for the Broken River Prize, which is the reason the chapbook came out. And then I want to shout out Natasha Treadway, who picked Fractures, selected it for the Felix Pollock Prize in Poetry, which is the only reason my book is going to be out in the world. So Hijito is kind of like a little glimpse into one of the motifs that I think my full-length collection explores, that unfortunately is very timely for our conversation today, and also forever relevant even in the time of COVID, even during shutdown. And the basic premise with Hijito, and this is probably the anchoring central motif of Fractures, is it's reckoning with the anxieties, joys of raising Black children in the U.S. And to do that, and for me to be a parent who's not of the African diaspora, for me to be somebody who is like often in much of my life a white passing Latinx, but then some parts I'm not white passing, and sort of so reckoning with colorism and white supremacy and fear and anxiety and dread and joy and all of it. And so that's what Hijito's focus is thinking through that. I think there's a lot of books. I haven't encountered a lot of books that reckon with that kind of focus of somebody who's looking both outward but turning the mirror on themselves. And I mean that in terms of somebody who is not of the diaspora, but is not a white person. So I think a lot of that is reckoned with in Hijito, and then I think I go even further in Fractures. So Fractures should be out end of September, early October, and Hijito came out last year, and it's available now. All this stuff you can pre-order, you can do all that stuff all on my website, which is just carloslive.com. One word, carloslive.com, and everything's there.
We'll drop the links in the comments below.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so this has been a wonderful conversation. I will be respectful of your time. I have one final question. You can just choose not to answer because
yeah.
But I am very curious about this thing. You mentioned being white passing but then not white somewhere else, or white sometimes white. So I mean, like, it's a very interesting concept, to me anyway. I mean, for me, it's very, very, very interesting being alive in the United States of America, and that like where I'm from, LA. I'm a Mexican. I'm very clearly a Mexican, right? But then, like, I go to like Kansas City, and
they don't know what to do with you.
Just go to like different parts of the country, and all of a sudden, they're just like, well, what are you?
Exactly.
Like, must be one of them, I don't know, like.
No, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So what's that like for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, the big joke is like I'm in New York, and people assume I'm Puerto Rican no matter what I say. but then I go somewhere else. You know, they think I'm Boricua, and then I go somewhere else, and then they think I'm Greek, or they think I'm whatever. I mean, this, and I think this is what I think my books are. My memoir too is very much trying to reckon with all the different nuanced, complicated dimensions of how identity operates. And I think for me, recognizing as well, I think there's a lot of, I think that we're in a moment where we really need like a rigorous evolving conversation, and this is particularly around race, but I mean just many identities, all of our identities. We have many identities, right? But I think there's so many folks who they're people who they'll say, oh no, I'm Colombiano, I'm Latinx, I'm whatever. I'm not white or whatever, and I'm like, well, when I get pulled over by a police officer, most of the time I'm not worried about dying in the traffic stop. And so but at the same time, I'll say, when I apply for an apartment in New York, nobody ever calls me back. In a job application, I can never not be Latinx. And so also to have a more, rigorous discussion about like the dimensions of this idea of passing, to understand how identities evolve, even notions of race, ethnicity, identity, all these things. They are multifaceted, and they're in flux, and they shift and they change. They're contextual, they're other things. So I think for me, like, I'm trying to always have that rigorous discussion while holding a mirror to myself to recognize, listen, I may not be benefited by white supremacy when I'm trying to get somebody to just call me back about an apartment. But when they often see me show up at the door, people are really cool with me living in the apartment. So to be able to hold space for both of those things, to hold space with both of those complexities, and the myriad of other complexities there. So I think a lot of my work forever, in addition to masculinity, this is kind of the intersectional nature of my work. I'm always reckoning with the intersection points with my other identities and all the different complex ways that they operate and inform the way that I'm allowed to move through the world, and the way that I'm allowed to move differently than my wife, who is a Black woman, and my kids, So that's a great question. We could have like 12 more hours of talking just on that question.
Yeah. I'm sure that's why I was Carlos, I really appreciate that. One last time, where can people find your work with your book?
Just find me carloslive.com is my website, or if you look me up on Twitter and Instagram, it's just at Carlos AG Live on Twitter and Instagram, at Carlos AG Live.
All right. Thank you so much, Carlos. It's been a wonderful hour we got to spend together.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate you making me a part of the project. Take care.